Tonight's news started with the Washington Post reporting that at least 8 fake Trump electors have accepted immunity deals. The New York Times then advanced that reporting that at least one other elector also has a deal, although that person's identity remains unknown. In other words, a bunch of people are all talking. Now, this is all part of Fulton County DA Fani Willis's much broader investigation into all the ways Trump and his allies attempted to overturn the 2020 election in Georgia. So that includes this fake elector scheme. It includes the Trump campaign's potential involvement in an unauthorized breach of election equipment, which took place in Coffee County in Georgia. And who could forget? It includes President Trump pressuring the Georgia Secretary of State to just find 11,780 votes. Okay. So other than the $200,000 that appears to have been wasted by the Georgia GOP defending these fake electors, the other big number to know here is that there were 16 fake electors total in Georgia. The Washington Post's reporting shows 8 of those electors with immunity deals. The New York Times suggests 9, but either way, that's all got to make the other electors a little nervous. Specifically, the Post points out that at least 2 of those other fake electors, the ones without immunity deals, they appear to remain targets of this investigation. One of whom, a man named David Schaefer, is the chairman of the Georgia Republican Party. And then, of course, there's the bigger picture here. What this kind of cooperation at the lower levels of this scheme might mean for the bigger fish. Rudy Giuliani oversaw the entire fake elector scheme, so I can't imagine this is a great Friday night for Rudy Giuliani. And then there is Senator Lindsey Graham, who, despite being a senator from South Carolina, also allegedly pressured the Georgia Secretary of State to throw out some ballots. And then, of course, there is President Trump himself, who is undeniably at the center of all of this. We're going to have some expert help breaking all of this down in just a second. But before we do, I want to show you one thing from the legal filing that tonight's Washington Post reporting is based on. This is the transcript of an exchange between one of Fani Willis's prosecutors and the defense attorney for these fake electors. Fani Willis's prosecutor says, quote, here's the deal. Either elector E is going to get this immunity and he's going to answer the questions, or we're going to leave. And if we leave, we're ripping up his immunity agreement and he can be on the indictment. He can be on the indictment. Just last week, we got the news that Fani Willis was warning local law enforcement to be on high alert between July 11th and September 1st because she could announce potential indictments. And now this. If I were Donald Trump, I would make sure all my summer travel plans are refundable. Joining me now is former U.S. Attorney and MSNBC legal analyst Barb McQuade. Barb, thank you for being here. Am I right to focus on this exchange between the prosecutor and one of the defense attorneys, where the prosecutor says his name will be on the indictment? Not a potential indictment, but the indictment.
Yeah, I think your reading is fair, Alex. The indictment suggests that it is not an if, but a when, that
yes,
there will be an indictment. And right now we're kind of sorting out who's going to be a witness and who's going to be a defendant. And prosecutors want to go after the bigger fish. Some of these people who are fake electors are not household names. They are people who are kind of used as pawns, likely knew what they were doing, but they may have some really valuable information that can help provide good incriminating evidence against some of the people who are higher up who are organizing these kinds of schemes. And so they're valuable as witnesses. And, you know, it doesn't give Fani Willis great pleasure to prosecute some no-name person who was used as a pawn in this scheme. And so I think they probably very much want maybe all 16 of them to cooperate. But 8's a pretty good number, and 9's even better. Yeah. But I agree with you that suggesting that, you know, I got 8. I don't need you. Take it or leave it. You want to be a witness. You want to be a defendant. Choice is up to you. Otherwise, you will be on the indictment. Does say to me that there will be an indictment here.
So there's a real discrepancy between what the defense attorney for these 8 with the immunity deal is saying in terms of what information they know about criminal activity. From the filing tonight, all of the electors, these are the ones with the immunity deal, remain united in their collective innocence and defenses, and none testified or believed that they or any other elector committed any wrongdoing, much less criminal acts, right? So then the question is, well, what do they know? If they don't think they're guilty of anything and they don't know of any other criminal acts among electors, you pointed this out. Do you infer from that the information they have that is then useful to Fani Willis is information about people who aren't electors, information about people who are maybe higher up in the food chain, information about people like, I don't know, Lindsey Graham or Rudy Giuliani or some of the high-level Trump officials who are orchestrating this?
Yeah, I'm not sure what to make of these conflicting statements because they may be in some ways sort of self-serving. What they really need probably is a judge to make sure that these clients are being well represented. When you have a joint defense, sometimes there can be a conflict of interest there. So that's one issue. Let's set that aside for a minute to answer your question. I think that Fani Willis isn't particularly interested in having one fake elector testify against another fake elector. As we said, these are small fish. If they committed a crime, we'll roll them into the indictment, and that's fine. But where they're more valuable is identifying people up the food chain. How is it that we had fake electors coming together in a number of different states? That's no coincidence that they all came together. What were they told? What was the purpose? Was this simply an honest provisional ballot just in case these fraud claims panned out and so that they'd have certificates on the books when the deadline came and went? Or did they know, no, this is all part of this plot. We're going to have Mike Pence take these and say they've created such an issue of confusion that we're going to throw out all the votes in Georgia and we're going to disregard those, or we'll let the legislature substitute its own choice for the electors there, and we'll control the outcome of the election in that way. So I think what they're more interested in from these electors is not testimony against each other, but testimony against higher-ups.
Yeah, and that then begs the question of who doesn't have an immunity deal, right? And what is it? What are the implications of that? We know that there are 3 people who appeared to remain targets of this investigation. One, David Schaefer, who we mentioned is the chairman of the Georgia Republican Party. One is Georgia Senator Sean Still, who is the person that confirmed the identity of the electors and let them into the room in the Capitol where they proceeded to do their thing. And then Kathy Latham, who played a key role in the Coffee County election system breach. We know that Kathy Latham now has new counsel. We know that there is a 9th person whose identity remains TBD. Do you have any suspicions about who that could be? Or I should ask, Barb, if that person is maybe Kathy Latham, who has new counsel, what could be the implications there in terms of, criminal charges?
Yeah, it's hard to speculate as to who this might be and what their role is. But, prosecutors typically like to work their way up the criminal chain, granting immunity to lower level defendants in exchange for their testimony and their cooperation is the way that prosecutors build cases all the time. And so it may be that you take the 8 who already have immunity and you ask them to talk about the roles of some of the people that you just identified. I believe there's reporting that David Schaefer told them that they had to keep very quiet and conceal what it was they were doing when they were going to prepare this false slate of electors. I mean, that suggests that he knew that he was engaging in wrongdoing. And so what you do perhaps is now you've got a strong case against him and see if you can flip him and get him to testify about who directed you to do this, to compile this list of fake electors. Did that come from somebody with the Trump campaign? And work your way up the chain in that way. And so it appears that's what Fani Willis is doing. It is a tried and true method that prosecutors use, and it seems like it's working here.